Well, it's been a long time since I've done one of these videos, and I check every morning to see what's going on with my channel, and it's steady at 41 subscribers, and I see maybe somebody poking around and keeps alive, if you will, the number of views, etc. They're very, very low, but nevertheless, I do have a channel. I do have lots of videos there in English and Spanish. And so, almost as a sense of duty or feeling that I should contribute something after this long while, which has been an eventful period in my life spiritually, and we're in Lent, and today is the transposed feast of Saint Joseph. I wanted to share with whoever will listen to this something that I had planned to do now for some time as a fun sort of personal, semi-personal sharing of something lighter than some of the topics I've been given to do. And it is to talk about my favorite saints. And it's interesting. I mean, I'm into the saints a lot, and I have been for a long time. I think the first favorite saint I had was Saint Martin de Porres. It's really Porras, but everybody knows him as Saint Martin de Porres, the Peruvian Dominican lay brother, because they passed around a comic book, I think in 1963, which is the year he was canonized, if I'm not mistaken, by Pope John the 23rd. And I used to attend catechism at the church, St. Agnes Church in Key Biscayne. I would go to Key Biscayne Elementary School, which was a public school. And I fell in love with this black saint, charitable, depicted in this comic book. And so that was really my first favorite saint. My father's great favorite saint was Saint Therese of Lisieux, and my mother's favorite saint was Saint John Bosco. So when I had my big conversion, one of many, in 1972, and started reading the Bible and reading certain things, and quickly believing that I had a religious vocation and I had a spiritual director, Father Villaronga, who was a famous Spanish Franciscan in Miami, having come from Cuba, where he had been a famous preacher as he was in Miami. And I think he recommended that I read, well, he recommended I read Fulton Sheen's Life of Christ. But the woman, close friend of my mother, who recommended this spiritual director, who was really a top priest in Miami, Amparo, lent me in English Papasoli's Life of St. Ignatius Loyola. So I guess maybe the first real biography that I read was a famous one by Giorgio Papasoli. I wouldn't have pronounced it like that at the time. Life of Ignatius Loyola. Later at University of Miami, later that same year, 72, I did read The Story of a Soul, not the critical, edition, just an old edition in beautiful English, I am sure, which I have been listening to in my car. Beautifully narrated, audible book. But what's interesting is that I was 19 years old, and I was given to making lists. I did lists of actresses and stuff like that, but I was given to making lists. And I came up with a list of 10 saints that um, I'm kind of unsure how I came upon each and every one of them. But in chronological order, which is how I made the list, and if you can read this, I suppose I could enlarge it and make it much more readable. If I could, you know, the list I made began with Dominic of Guzman, St. Dominic. I suppose by that time I was already thinking of the Dominicans, even though I was afraid that they were too studious or intellectually demanding, because I was unsure of myself. And then, of course, Francis of Assisi. So the list starts with those two. Then Thomas Aquinas. At the time, I don't think I knew anything about Thomas Aquinas, but apparently in my reading, and a lot of it came from the World Book Encyclopedia, Thomas Aquinas figures in this list. In fact, it's a list with 1, 2, 3, 4 Dominicans, and then already 1, 2, 3 Carmelites. So then Catherine of Siena, and I'm not sure why. I consider it to have been one of my intuitions that I've had often in my life that provides a certain knowledge to me that is not so much the product of reasoning or anything. It's just some sort of affinity, or maybe even some sort of knowledge by connaturality, where you love saints and you sort of gravitate. Just one little thing, you'll see it later when I have the expanded list with Elizabeth of the Trinity. And it could be something as simple as the fact that she was an attractive young woman, Carmelite in her habit, and actually the picture, and we'll talk about it, that is so attractive, was the last picture taken of her just before she died of Addison's disease in 1906, when she was skeletal. I mean, she couldn't eat or even drink water. So then Catherine of Siena, how did she get in there? Now, of course, all these saints now I have read a lot about. There's not too much to read about Martin de Porres. I have read the acts of his beatification. They're very repetitious, but that's what can be known about him. And I did buy a good biography of him, which I actually gave away because there's really not much primary source material about him. But the rest of them I've read. And Thérèse de l'Enfant Jésus, Thérèse of Lisieux, I've read everything she's ever written in French, and many books, especially in French, about her. So anyway, then Íñigo de Loyola, Ignatius of Loyola, and I wrote a little paper about him at the University of Miami, where I enrolled after dropping out of the University of Florida, where I began college in 1971. And then Teresa of Avila, of Jesus, how did she get on this list? I am not sure. At 19 years of age, what I knew about her was probably nothing. John of the Cross, a little different. Maybe that's how I came to know about her. At University of Miami, I had a Spanish teacher because I had already enrolled at University of Miami with the idea of perfecting my Spanish, especially reading and writing. I spoke Spanish at home with a very limited vocabulary, but all my reading and everything was in English since the age of 8, basically. And I was now, 19. So this very nice professor at University of Miami, lady professor, forget her name, maybe Doctora de la Vega or some other name like that, because I confused it with a high school teacher. She said, read St. John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul, or read, his biography or something. I fell in love completely to this day with the poem The Dark Night of the Soul, The Dark Night, Noche Oscura. And I have videos on that in case you want to poke around my channel. Then, of course, Martin de Porres could not be missing. He was my first favorite saint. I already knew he was a Dominican by the time this list was made. And then John Bosco, who I really didn't know that much about. I just knew my mother liked him a lot and named me Emilio John, because of John Bosco. I actually wear a little medal around my neck, not the original one that was lost by a friend of mine who shall remain unnamed. That was my baptismal 18 karat gold St. John Bosco medal. So I bought a 10 karat gold one many years later. And then, of course, I already, because of my father especially, liked Therese of the Child Jesus. So maybe I'll get a chance to speak more about these saints when we look at the long list. But this is like I'm sharing with you what my thoughts may have been at the time I drew the list. It really were saints that I gravitated towards without really knowing why. So then, years later, I had already, thought about saints a lot, and I kept toying with the list, and finally decided to have 9 groups of 3. So I guess that's 27 saints. Things tend to grow. And interestingly enough, the first one is Saint Joseph, whose feast is March 19 and today is March 20, because yesterday was the 4th Sunday of Lent. So Saint Joseph, of course, is the father, foster father of Jesus. Teresa of Avila was very devoted to him, and I did get to see at least the outside of the convent of St. Joseph in Avila, rather small, when I visited Avila in 1981. So that was a very nice trip to Avila. I went to the La Encarnacion, the convent of Teresa, the big one that she had been in, very lax convent, luxurious for those nuns with money, etc. But then I suppose I think it joined the Reform, and certainly today is the place to visit to see the things of Teresa of Avila. And so, and I try to use the original sort of names of these saints pretty much. So let me see if I can enlarge this so that it is more easily seen. If I make it like 26 again, let's see, no, it won't work. Let's see whether the font can be enlarged. It even doesn't even do it, huh? So I don't know why it doesn't do that. So then, in chronological order, the second saint would be Mary Magdalene, the apostle of the apostles, also a favorite of the Dominican orders. They have a shrine to her in southern France where she reputedly ended her days, etc. So I have a special devotion to her. I forgot that in my preparation for things, I actually have pictures of all these saints. And I did this specifically for this video weeks ago. So this is the Holy Family, very dear to me because in Rome I stay with the nuns of the Holy Family. Le Suore della Sacra Famiglia. It's actually a Catalonian foundation from Maria Janer, and I stayed with them since '89, many, 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 many times, often twice a year. And so when I think of the Holy Family, I think of them. And then I said Mary Magdalene, and this is my favorite picture of her, given to me by those Dominicans in the south of France by mail. I haven't visited there. And then, after Mary Magdalene, of course, you have Saint Paul. So that's an icon purchased for me, I think, in Ephesus by a priest of the seminary where I taught. I was inspired to get something like this by a dear Dominican friend of mine who passed away recently, Gonzalo Valderas, and he had one in his room, and I always wanted one, and I finally got this one, which is very nice. And of course, who doesn't like St. Paul, right? But I have notes on St. Paul. I taught St. Paul for a long time. I identify quite a bit with St. Paul. So if you're interested in a 80 or 90 page commentary on the authentic letters of Paul, you can poke around in my website, Bible Explainer. Google Bible Explainer Chavez. You should get my website, and in course notes for courses, biblical courses, you'll find my commentary on Paul. Of course, Hieronymus, the holy name, who any Bible person likes Jerome. So I found this picture of Jerome. I've read something about his life. I mean, he went to Bethlehem and had temptations and everything. Passionate Bible scholar, irascible temper. So I identify with that. I identify with that too. And he had a group of women, which I identify with too. Holy women, Paula and some others, Eutike, I guess, her daughter. Studying the Bible passionately. And he met in the Aventine, one of the hills of Rome where the Dominicans have Santa Sabina and the Benedictines have St. Anselm. And I think the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican is there too. One of them was a friend of mine, but anyway, the Aventine is a beautiful place. But Jerome was, all about the Bible, the Vulgate. I read the New Testament Vulgate every night, and I'm very, devoted. I could not put him in. Then, of course, Augustine. Who doesn't like Augustine with his, conversion and all the other things? And I found this picture of Augustine because I don't think there are very many of them that make a lot of sense, but this one at least looks like a nice engraving. So I don't have to say too much about Augustine. And then, of course, Dominic, that I already mentioned. Of course, I was in his order, and I wish I had remained, but I didn't. And this is, I think, Fra Angelico, and I have a nice poster of this and of St. Catherine together in my living room. And I'm reading every day now as part of my spiritual morning reading the book that I took to Mexico when I joined the Dominicans, the BAC, the Biblioteca de Autores Cristianos, the Library of Christian Authors. It's now out of business. It was a Spanish publisher that published everything, all the fathers, all the saints, and, critical editions for, the 1950s, 1960s Spanish style kind of thing, not Germans. And this is a beautiful image of Saint Dominic. So I fell in love with him, his gentleness, and then the love of study. I lost my fear of the intellectual demands and abandoned the Franciscan interests that I had, especially since my spiritual director was a Franciscan and he never encouraged me to be a Franciscan. So when my mother and I visited St. Dominic's Church in Miami, and they were eager to receive me, and I told my spiritual director, he says, well, he was very dry, reserved man. He did not smile or gesture. He said, if you have that opportunity, and that was all he needed to say. So I'm a Dominican at heart, and in the afterlife, I hope to be able to put on their habit again and celebrate with them the Salve Regina for Compline. Of course, Francis of Assisi is everybody's favorite saint, and so this is reputed to be the oldest drawing of Francis. I believe this is in Subiaco, where I visited the Benedictine place in the mountains there, not far from Rome. And since there's no halo, no stigmata, no indications of the later Francis, apparently someone there when he visited, and he would visit, made a picture of him. And it's not Saint Francis, it's Francis before being Saint Francis. Very beautiful. And then, of course, you can't have Francis without Clare. And this has always been my favorite picture of Clare. I have it as a holy card. It's not common. I don't think we know who did this. It's not the common one of Clare that's more common. This one looks very medieval and very pale type, medieval diet type of complexion. I don't know that much. I mean, I've read enough about her. To me, she's still a kind of a murky figure, very beloved. Everybody's seen the movies, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, and all that. And I've read her rule, and I've read about her. I think she was rather stern, is what I gather. Beloved, she lived to be about 60, so she didn't die too young, or young for that period. Loved Francis, and I think they brought his body near the San Damaso, that's what it is, the convent that I've been very close to, and I've been to her tomb and everything. Very beloved saint, and these are, I intuited, well, this was after my early intuition, but nevertheless, I have deep love, and she's one of my 27 favorite saints. Then, of course, Thomas Aquinas, whom, of course, I got to study more and to love more. I've been to Fossa Nova and Rocaseca, where he was born and died with Father Reggie. I guess the Fossa Nova would be the Cistercian Abbey where he died. Rocaseca is where he was born. That's just ruins. When we went, in the 90s, late 90s, but of course the Dr. Angelicus, I did graduate from the Angelicum. I have a lot of love for him, and now that I'm in my retirement, and in Mexico, I purchased most of the Summa Theologica. I think they really say it's supposed to be Summa Theologiae. But I have, and then I purchased additional volumes that were missing, some only in Latin, which I think I'll be able to do something with if I get to them, because the first, whole bunch of volumes in Spanish and Latin will take me a while, and I may give up after the first or two. I mean, it's rather tedious, but nevertheless, we Dominicans hold St. Thomas in the highest regard, holiness and study. And when I run into these people that think it's all faith and emotion, and they poo-poo intellectualism, I say that's not my tradition. And it goes back to 1215. So, you know, Catherine of Siena, which I already mentioned. Now I've read, of course, everything she ever wrote, all her letters, the dialogue in old Italian editions. Some of these, I think, are transcribed from the Latin because she dictated in her Siena dialect, and then the copyists would, I think, copy in Latin, but then they would revert to her dialect more or less. And then we have Giuliana Cavallini is the great expert on the divine dialogue and other things of Catherine. And so I've read both the modern Italian plus the old Italian plus all the letters. It's like 1,500 pages. And my love for the Mama could not be higher. Rita of Cascia. I was baptized in Cuba in the Church of Rita, Saint Rita. And, she's famous for that spine in her forehead, etc. I've been to Rocaporena. I have seen her casket in the basilica in Cascia, but I was able to get to, it wasn't easy with the taxi situation and all kinds of stuff, to get to the very old medieval house in Rocaporena on a hill. So I have deep devotion to her. I think there's a lot of unknown things about her. I know the story around her as an Augustinian is quite developed. I have done the 15 Thursdays of St. Rita. I discovered that when I was in Rome in my sabbatical semester in the spring of 2011. And I've read a very critical book about her, short book, but very scholarly and maybe too critical. So there's a lot of things that are unknown about her. Probably most of the information really known is inscribed in the casket, and it's not very much. That her family and herself were pacificatori, I think they call them. They would make peace among feuds, and her sons were involved in feuds and all that, and she wanted to be an Augustinian, and they refused, and she finally landed in the convent or something, and supposedly this thorn from Christ's crown that got stuck miraculously in her forehead caused quite a stench, which is kind of funny in a way. And then they took a trip to Rome, I think, and the stench disappeared for the trip, so that the other, nuns and people of the party would not be, so repulsed. She's supposed to be the saint of the impossible cases. So I was baptized in her church. How could I not love Saint Rita? And all Italians love her. Then, of course, we get to a beautiful saint that I discovered later on. In fact, I may have discovered her very strangely when, in 2004, two friends of mine came from Miami with me to Rome for me to show them around and just to, hang out. And I showed them by serendipity. I wound up in Santa Maria Nova, the church where Francesca Romana, Francis of Rome, is buried. And we actually saw, I think, her skeleton. And something happened to me just seeing her name or seeing where I was, one of these visitations. And I fell in love with Frances of Rome. And I've read some books about her. Now, in my spring sabbatical, semester sabbatical 2011, I think it was it was Wednesday, March 9, if I'm not mistaken. I went right after class. I was taking a course on Flavius Josephus and the New Testament by Professor Sievers at the Biblicum. I was auditing it officially or unofficially, but I certainly did all the work and everything. And I rushed to the Basilica Santa Maria Nova for Mass with the Olivetti fathers, who I love dearly. St. Catherine knew them. And they were the directors of Frances of Rome, and she founded these oblates. So I spoke to one of them after the Mass at some length. And I bought beautiful objects and books at the Basilica. This is 7 years after I discovered her with my friend in 2004. And I assiduously found out when they would open Tor de Specchi, her monastery. Beautiful. I could show you pictures of it. Because that was all, Easter, Lent, and Lent Easter period, and the normal opening dates. It opens once a year. Were not the same dates. But I got in and I saw it. I took beautiful pictures. It would be probably difficult to find them, and I would screw up the rest of this thing. But maybe one day I'll do a Tor de Specchi photo tour or something. But she, very beloved. When I went to the Church of St. Agnes in Agone at Piazza Navona, and I got friendly with the religious article sales lady, she made a special favor for me and took me to the baptismal font of Francesca Romana. So these are all graces that one receives. Now, right after Francesca Romana comes Francesco di Paula. Now, this is another one that when I was in Rome studying, living there in 1996, the very first Sunday, actually the vigil of the first Sunday of Advent, 1996, I was with a Dominican friend of mine, Father Ramos. And he said to me, we have to part. So I said, fine. And I went right into the church in front of me, Sant'Andrea delle Fratte. I had no idea what church this was. It doesn't look like much. It's near the Spanish Steps. And celestial music was being played. And I enter there and I see that Alphonse Ratisbon, this Jewish man, had seen the Virgin and converted, and her image at the altar was beautiful. And I knew immediately this was a very, very holy place. It actually became my favorite church in Rome, which means in the world. But if you go to the side altar, you will see you will see the this picture. It's very small here of St. Francis of Paula. He was named because of St. Francis of Assisi. He's from Calabria, southern place. And he didn't want to be like the friars minor. the minor friars of St. Francis. He wanted to be the least, the minimi, the minims. He wanted to be more minor than the minors. And so I would go to this church all the time. And I've read his life. He was in France, and I think he died in France. He was counselor to kings, etc. A very humble man. I don't think he ever became a priest. And here in this holy card, which I don't have, I got it on the internet, it says that this is a portrait of Bourdichon offered by Francis I to Leon X in 1519, kept in Rome in the Vatican Palace. I assume Francis I is a French king. The little poor one, Friar Francis of Paul, minim of the minimal servants of Jesus Christ, our blessed Lord. That's how he would sign. Lo poverello, frate Francesco di Paula minimo, degli minimi, servi di Gesù Cristo, benedetto nostro Signore. So he is, if you see this in Caritas, love, agape is on top of his, that beautiful, him with the walking stick of the pilgrim, etc. Then, of course, we get into more modern period, Ignatius of Loyola, which everybody knows about. This holy card I got in Loyola. I visited the castle. I cried for hours at the altar in the sacristy where he is with his, more than a cilicium, more than a cilicium type of, penitential girdle. He was covered with robe. And since I had read his life and Manresa, the cave, and all this other stuff, 7 hours on his knees every day, I was very moved for a very long time. I almost held up the tourist companions that I had. And this one says that this is a photograph of an authentic portrait or painting of St. Ignatius of Loyola, painted in 1585. Now, he was already dead. By Alonso Sanchez Coelho, but burned the 11th of May, 1931. I assume that's Civil War, maybe not yet, but still it was burned. Then, of course, Rose of Lima. Actually, I'm sorry, Teresa of Jesus, we already talked about her. Now, this is a painting by Fray Juan de la Miseria. And I was also a Carmelite, and I lived in Spain, and I lived in Madrid during the week in the general house or next to the general house. And in the choir there is the tomb of the painter of Santa Teresa, San Juan de la Miseria, St. John of Misery. And she has a funny thing that she told them about his painting her ugly, beady-eyed and all that. But this is the famous painting of Saint Teresa of Avila. So I skipped her. And then, of course, we have John of the Cross. And this is, I think, a pretty good painting of his. I have videos on him, so I don't think we need to say too much about him. And then I said Rose of Lima. Actually, no, Martin de Porres. So, boy, I'm getting confused here. So this is a good one of Martin de Porres. He was like a 3 races, Spanish father, the mother from Panama, Indian and black. So he had those kinds of bloodlines. I love him very much. I was in Lima. I was in his convent. I had a great guide that I just met by serendipity. And Martin of Charity with his broom. And I have couple of statues of him one in cedar that I love to smell. And then in that trip too, St. Rose of Lima. Now there's many different pictures of her, but this is from the cover of a book I bought in the cathedral. And she disfigured her face because she was very beautiful, etc. It's not the prettiest picture, but I wanted to share the cover of this book, written by her confessor, by the way. I saw her cell, and by serendipity, as I approached the cell, I see a Dominican, and lo and behold, he's a famous Spanish Dominican from Mexico that I had never met, but had heard about for years and years. So those are the kind of things that happen, especially if you are a little inquisitive. You have to make a move. If you say, I'm shy, I'm not going to speak to this guy, you'll never find out who he was. Of course, be it far from me to be like that. And then I fell in love somewhere along the line with Louis-Marie Grignon de Montfort. And I'm doing the consecration to Mary now. I'm on day 21, I guess it is. 25th will be, actually, no, 20 something. And the 33rd day will be Friday. And the consecration, the 25th of March, the Annunciation, is Saturday. And this is the statue of this humble, humble man, forgotten. Even his book was forgotten for 100 years or so. He's got this huge statue in the Vatican. A very tender, humble man. Pope John Paul II got the totus tuum from his book, The True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, which I'm rereading again. And then, of course, I discovered somewhere along the line in the 80s, I guess, this homeless saint. And I have a video about him. And I've read a good amount about him, including that by his confessor in Italian of the time, 17th or 18th century. And so I recommend you find my video. It's not hard to find. Benedict Joseph Labre. And why I identify so much with this homeless saint who died at 35, April 16, the same age and the same day that Bernadette died, about 100 years after him. Another humble Saint Bernadette. So then comes, of course, famous Giovanni Bosco, Don Bosco. I visited Turin in that spring semester sabbatical. Deborah Contrato showed me his room. She worked there. And when I was doing my studies in Rome towards the end, when I was living in the Angelicum, Convito San Tommaso, I realized that even though I had sort of poo-pooed this saint of children, I realized my mother, in entrusting me to him, commending me to him, had done a very wise thing, and he had done his best with poor material to at least get me to study theology and things like that. Very interesting. And he wrote with the nuns of Francesca Romana. And I have that some of that correspondence. So it's a small world. He was always looking for funds. So he would go to Torre Specchi, which is near Teatro Marcello, right near Piazza Venezia, Campidoglio in Rome. And he would ask for, donations and things like that. Now we get to more modern, and we get to Bernadette Subihu. And I have more than one video about her in English and Spanish, so everybody knows about her now. My love for her is right up there with Thérèse of Lisieux. I don't want to say much more. I've read all her writings, and I've read a lot about her. I've read the 6 volumes in French by Laurentin on every little detail of Lourdes you could think of, and the patois, and the spellings, and the this, and the that, and the versions. I've read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. I've even read the book of a spiritual director she had for 1 or 2 times, Michel Garicoy. I read his biography. That's how much I love her. And so I don't want to say much more. I've been to Never twice. I think she's smiling at me here. I've been to Lourdes twice. And see the videos, they're very heartfelt. Then, of course, when I arrived in Mexico in July, mid-July 1973, I went to Tultenango, this ex-hacienda. I have videos on this. I don't want to talk too much about it. I don't want to take too long here. And in this beautiful countryside ex-hacienda, not in great condition, but still a seigneurial place, we would read, we were postulants, we would read in the refectory. It was really a dining room. And what they were reading was the spiritual biography of Charles de Foucault by Francois Sis, a great biographer, great expert, great books on Thérèse of Lisieux. The Véritable Enfant, the true childhood of Thérèse of Lisieux. Is a great critical kind of book. And so I fell in love with Charles de Foucault. I have videos on him in English and Spanish, so I love him very, very, very much. He's one of those places I have not visited. Not the Sahara, not in France. That's one saint I have not, places I have not visited. Elizabeth of the Trinity. I did go to, actually I skipped Thérèse of Lisieux. So I've said so much about her, and I have videos on her, so I don't need to say too much about her. I already said a lot about her. But then you have Elizabeth of the Trinity, that I finally got to visit her after falling in love with her in 1973. It took 38 years, just like Deuteronomy 2:14, of wandering around, to get to the outskirts of Dijon, where her community's new convent transferred for reasons unknown. Apparently, they haven't said why they left the original one. I assume it's inside the city, not good. So this is out in the country. I spent the night there. I prayed with the nuns. I wrote in their livre d'or, their golden book, and they immediately, a nun knocked on my door and says, "We have a gift for you, un cadeau," and they gave me a strand of her hair. Now, she was at most blessed at the time, not canonized like she is now. This is 2011, the same semester sabbatical. I planned that pilgrimage trip in April very carefully. I was there April 6th, anniversary of my leaving Cuba. So I've read all her works, all her letters in French, and I love her deeply, deeply. And then we have one that I discovered somewhere along the line. What struck me was that the Nazis did experiments on him. He died at the hands of the Nazis. He was one of the founders of the University of Nijmegen in Holland. Beautiful man. I've read some of his writings. He was a Carmelite, not discalced. A real saint. Smoked a pipe in the concentration camp. And he's one of my favorite saints. I think Tito is only a blessed still. And finally, last but not least, and I was there at her canonization, and I love her deeply, and I discovered her too in that novitiate with the Dominicans, 1973. All I needed to do was read 2 lines from a book by a prioress in that convent, I think in Holland, Holland of Hecht, I think it is. She was in Cologne for a while, then she went to this convent in Holland. And I've read, a lot of her stuff, not her doctoral thesis, but I'd read The Science of the Cross. In fact, I have to say this kind of funny. I read The Science of the Cross in Italian before I knew any Italian, just with a dictionary, when I was with the Descalced Carmelites in the Dominican Republic, and all they had was The Science of the Cross in Italian. I had never studied Italian, but I wanted to read that book badly. Anything by her, but that book especially. And with an Italian dictionary that they did have, Italian Spanish, I was able to get through it. Today I could read it easily, but at the time, it was a labor of love. I love her very much, and I went to her canonization in Rome, which was a little bittersweet, given all the factors. I did protest against a Jewish friend visitor to the seminary who spoke and said that she had converted to avoid the Nazis. That's so false. It's offensive. She was born in 1892, and she converted at the age of 30 in 1922, before any Nazis were on the horizon. Now, she entered the Carmelites, I think, when the Nazis were already in power. She had been prohibited from teaching and all that. You might say, which is not true, that she became a Carmelite because of the Nazis. That you could maybe, if you wanted to think that, maybe. But to say that she became a Christian because of the Nazis shows, first, utter ignorance. Secondly, utter imprudence at saying stuff you don't know, which can be a slur or can be an insult, and it's just fake news and bad. In every case, in every sense. And thirdly, I mean, it's just I hate fake news of any kind and misleading people. And when you want that axe to grind, dismiss a vocation like Edith Stein's by dint, by under cover of fighting anti-Semitism or something, you got the wrong weapons to fight something that needs to be fought. When you have the wrong weapons, you're not really fighting it. You're probably even worsening things. But anyway, this is a true conversion, not shachat, not this massacre of Jews that I know all about and I'm totally against and I suffer with it, like they did in Spain in the late 14th century, then the late 15th century. I know all about that. And I have videos on that probably, but she is not a case of that. She read the life of Teresa of Avila, famous story. She was with a group of Jewish people that were interested in Christianity, Husserl being one of them. All these kind of people got together. And she spent the night very famously at a house of a friend and came upon the autobiography of Teresa of Avila, who was of Jewish ancestry. Her grandfather had done the San Benito, and I know a lot of stuff about that. And she read the book all through the night. She couldn't stop and said, "This is the truth." She was a philosopher. So you can't hide the truth. You shouldn't want to. And you should rejoice at whatever truth you discover, because ultimately it's all good. And I mean that in the right way. She was Jewish. And she became not only a Catholic, but a Carmelite, which is an order that can trace itself to Elijah and to a woman of Jewish ancestry, Teresa of Avila, who was very Jewish in her business and academic, study interests. We have to arrive at a new synthesis of things. We can't be cancel culture in the bad sense. I hear Bill Maher, who I think is brilliant. I think he's a little cocky sometimes, but to say that some of the woke people don't like Abraham Lincoln because you're going to cancel everybody, then you're going to have to cancel yourself. I was going to put an adjective behind that. It's not the truth. But Edith Stein does represent she's one of the patronesses of Europe, the drama of European recent human history. And I'm reading Anne Frank every single night. I am united to Anne Frank in heaven, where she is, with Hashem. And I live that drama as much as I can, because I identify with the underdog and the sufferer, and with Jews, as Jews, as much as anyone can. And therefore, it's fitting that the last word is by this. And this is the picture that they had in the kitchen in the Dominican Republic, in a very rough house that we stayed in as Descalced Carmelites. They had Elizabeth of the Trinity, they had Teresa of Avila, they had the Little Flower, and they had Edith Stein in this particular pre-convent picture, kind of an austere look. She may have already been teaching in Speyer. I think she was teaching. It's the Dominican school in Speyer with the nuns there. So anyway, 56 minutes, it's a little longer than usual, but I thought this was fun. It's from the heart, my favorite saints, 27 of them, starting with Saint Joseph, whose feast we are celebrating today.